The birth of modern social anthropology. Some subjects or disciplines emerge in a slow and complicated way, and it is not possible to say exactly when or where they originated. But this is not so in social anthropology, as taught and practiced in the intellectual Stirling zone, in what had been the British Empire, and what continues to be, in the intellectual and academic spheres, its zone of influence. Within the British Empire and its successor states, and more important perhaps, its successor universities, the beginning of it all is clear, distinct, and visible. There are traditional and founded religions, traditional and founded states, and evidently traditional and founded disciplines. Social anthropology is a founded discipline with a clear point of origin, from which all, or very nearly all, then follows. It has a founder who set it up. The baseline of social anthropology is the replacement of Sir James Frazer by Bronislaw Malinowski as the paradigmatic anthropologist. It is all a little like the foundation of the English state itself. The English kingdom effectively begins with William the Conqueror. Before him there is a kind of haze in which nebulous figures with funny names such as Æthelred appear, without real continuity or any clear order, or much conviction. The status of figures such as Alfred or Arthur, fact or romance, is none too clear. Undoubtedly, something must have been going on in those ill-documented days, and specialists are familiar with it. But it does not add up to a clear and continuous story, internalized by present members of the English community and providing them with a kind of orientation. After William, on the other hand, the sequence is clear and without gaps. The story has its morals and antagonisms. Everyone has his sympathies and antipathies, and the affinities between past and present alignments become visible. It becomes a living past, linked emotionally to the present. British social anthropology is rather similar. Bronislaw Malinowski is the William the Conqueror of the subject. His victory set up the regime which, give or take a bit of turbulence or a few modifications now and then, has persisted ever since, and whose legitimacy is not seriously contested. Frazer, on the other hand, was Harold, the only member of the previous dynasty who, thanks precisely to being its terminal point, has a clear and unambiguous place in folk memory and who contributes to the story. There are other pre-Bronislaw figures who are of genuine importance and who are even objects of very serious attention, but it is less than clear just how, if at all, they relate to each other. They emerge from the swirling mists of time, but the clouds never disperse sufficiently for a clear and coherent canvas to become manifest and to imprint itself on the mind. Before the First World War, there was no anthropological profession. Individual scholars pursued their interests, and some even secured university employment, but there was nothing by way of a sustained professional community. All this was due to change with Malinowski. He marks the beginning of firm institutionalization, as well as the start of a continuous intellectual story. The difference between Frazer and Malinowski did not lie only in the framework which surrounded them and the institutions which sustained them or which they lacked. There was also a clear, neat, and dramatic difference in their doctrines, ideas, style, and general approach. The contrast is marked and illuminating. The move from Frazer to Malinowski constitutes a complete break, a coupure. Frazer exemplifies, almost to perfection and with elegant simplicity, the preoccupations, ideas, and opportunities which had, in the 19th century, engendered the subject of anthropology in the first place. The coming and acceptance of Darwinism had made it manifest that mankind had a history over and above the document-based record which preoccupies conventional historians. The evolutionary aspect of Darwinism, the stress on continuity of development, made it at the very least plausible to suspect that surviving pre-literate peoples might illustrate the condition of primitive peoples of the past, whose social organization was otherwise barely accessible. The hope of establishing an evolutionary account of human development was tempting, and of course it would have philosophical and political implications. The pattern of evolution would provide a charter for power ranking in a world pervaded by a new type of empire, territorially discontinuous, where the power holders seemed to be at a different stage of social development from those they ruled. In brief, Darwinism had bestowed more past on humanity than men had previously suspected or bargained for, and the newly acquired past was full of the most potent suggestiveness. Contemporary ethnography, brought in en passant by missionaries, colonial administrators, and travelers, or in Russia by forcibly exiled political prisoners, provided at the very least a hope of access to a time machine which would facilitate inspection of an otherwise lost past. This newly acquired plethora of past called out for a more systematic investigation. Ethnography was there to satisfy the need. Anthropology became the remembrance of things collectively past. It would only be a matter of time before the satisfaction of this need became professionalized. It should be stressed that this was how things were, all in all, in Western Europe. In other parts of Europe it was different. A British anthropologist was a man who, under the impact of Darwinism, was eager to use surviving savages as evidence concerning the past of all humanity. By contrast, a Central European ethnographer was a man who, under the impact of nationalism and populism, was eagerly exploring and codifying a peasant culture in the hope of preserving and protecting it, above all from encroachment by rival nationalisms. A Russian ethnographer was a man filling in time because the Tsar had sent him to Siberia. But to return to Western Europe, two items provided the main elements in Frazer's general approach to this problem. First of all, he was an evolutionist in the basic formulation of his problem. His central question was, by what path did mankind arrive at its present condition? Evolutionism is more a state of mind, a tendency to ask genetic questions, than a positive doctrine, and in this sense Frazer was, very profoundly, an evolutionist. Secondly, he was an avid user of the new time machine made available in the by now rather rich and rapidly growing mass of ethnographic literature. He mastered an incredible amount of it and reproduced it, in elegant, somewhat mellifluous Augustan prose, in his widely known, though in its unabridged version seldom read, masterpiece, The Golden Bough. In method, Frazer was an indefatigable magpie of genius. He gathered all the material he could find, and he found a very great deal. The fact that he had to use the material he found in the writings of others meant that he could not probe further for the context of the information which came his way. He had to use it as it was. The use of such material committed him, at least by implication, to a denial of the relevance of context. He had, at the very least, to behave as if one could use the information that a given tribe believed this or practiced that, without necessarily possessing other information concerning its form of life. The belief, the ritual, or the institution had to be used as a kind of acceptable atomic datum, significant and usable in itself, which could then make its contribution to the construction or validation of a theory, notwithstanding the fact that it floated in a context-free vacuum. There were other important features of Frazer's intellectual style. He was a classicist, but a classicist with a difference. Classicists are, generally speaking, intellectual snobs. What attracts them in the classical world is its excellence, one might say its miraculous excellence. They are attracted by its outstanding achievements. Frazer specialized in Pausanias, a kind of guide to late Greek culture who recorded local practices and beliefs. In other words, he focused not on the miraculous intellectual achievements of the Hellenes, which distinguished them from almost anyone else, but, on the contrary, on that superstitious underside of Hellenic culture which does not greatly distinguish the Greeks from anyone, if indeed it distinguishes them at all. This orientation already made Frazer into an anthropologist rather than a classicist, even when he was dealing with documentary material from a literate society. In his philosophical orientation, which provided him with the ideas from which he constructed his theories, Frazer was an empiricist associationist, an almost perfect disciple of David Hume. His conception of the working of the human mind was that of a kind of associative mechanism which links one experienced element with another in virtue of their resemblance or their contiguity in experience, plus a few other similar simple relations. Whether he obtained this vision directly from reading David Hume or from some other 19th century follower of Hume is not entirely clear, but it hardly matters. The similarities between the two psychological visions is striking and obvious. Everything Frazer says about the sympathetic magic, or homeopathic magic, phrases he coined, might just as well have come straight from Hume. So if Frazer obtained his problem from the evolutionist post-Darwinian Fragestellung and his data by the magpie method, then the tools for handling the data came from associationist empiricist psychology. There is one further feature of Frazer's intellectual procedure which deserves notice, what might be called the pluperfect method. Like other evolutionists, he used the past to explain the present. That seemed the natural way to carry on. But if something was found in the past for the emergence of which further evidence was lacking, Frazer's instinctive reaction was to seek something still further back in the past, which would in turn explain what required explanation. The official plot of the Golden Bough has precisely this form, a strange classical institution, the rule of succession for the priesthood at Nemi, by which the new priest must kill the old one in order to take office, is in the end explained by speculative practices, which allegedly took place even further back in time. The supporting evidence sustaining this speculative theory was based on analogy with other similar practices found in the ethnographic record in other parts of the world, on the assumption, or was it the conclusion, that the human mind works in similar ways everywhere. These analogies could support the hypothesis concerning the proto-history of Nemi, for which no direct evidence was available. The official theory Frazer constructed was evolutionist in form and associationist in content. The book was meant not only to explain the grisly events at Nemi, but to explain the intellectual development of mankind. He postulated a famous three-stage theory of the development of the human mind, which, on his view, passed through three successive conditions, that of magic, of religion, and of science. In magic, man expected that like would cause like, or that associations as such were causally effective. Man, in fact, behaved precisely as Hume's treatise would lead one to expect, but at a rather low, uncritical level. Having noticed that things didn't always work, primitive man introduced the Hilfhypothese of animism, of spirits behind events, which controlled them and thereby accounted for the failure of crude magical associationism to deliver the goods. For Frazer, such animism was the essence of religion. When this failed in turn, man at long last turned to experimentally controlled associationism, to exploring just which associations were genuinely effective and which were not, and differentiating between superficial similarities and genuine causal connections. Frazer did not suggest that any one of these successive principles or styles was exclusively present during any one historical period. It was a matter of relative predominance, not of exclusive presence. There are many things wrong with this theory. For instance, its intellectualism. The theory, as formulated officially by Frazer in the passages in which he sums up his conclusion, seems to presuppose that when primitive man affirms a formula, which, when translated, seems to express a belief, or when he practices a rite accompanying some such formula, he is a theoretician, concerned with understanding, predicting, and controlling nature, rather than being, say, a person reinforcing the social order of which he is part, by reminding everyone, in a solemn manner, of the system of social relations of which they are a part. It all assumes, rather implausibly, that someone is keeping a tally of the successes and failures of magical and religious operations, and that such a record eventually induces mankind at large to change intellectual direction. None of this makes much sense. It may be said that Frazer's intellectualism is aided, or perhaps actually engendered, by his magpie method. The fact that the accounts he processes are presented out of context makes it hard to investigate what purpose the activities described really serve. Such descriptions encourage the naive, simple, and intellectualist assumption that the primitive shaman was really a fellow intellectual, an investigative scholar, and one who generally got it wrong. In his actual practice, Frazer was not always so naive, though his greatest sophistication, when present, was in conflict with his formerly propounded theories. For instance, when comparing the polytheism of classical antiquity with the doctrinal monotheism which followed it, he is, like Hume and Gibbon before him, full of admiration for the civic-minded, tolerant, this-worldly spirit of the ancients, compared with the egotistic and otherworldly orientation of the new faith. But such an account makes it obvious that the difference between the two types of religion lay not in their theories of nature, but rather in their impact on social organization and conduct. However, as stated, this insight, which certainly inspired his attitude to the two successive civilizations, is in no way incorporated into his main, officially proclaimed theory about the great stages of human thought. As far as the main theory goes, the difference between classical antiquity and Christianity is the difference between two theories of nature, one of them presumably with a much heavier load of magic, whereas the other systematizes or centralizes its animism into a single, very dominant spirit. Apart from the official evolutionist associationist Frazer, and the less official classicist anti-monotheist, there is also a third Frazer, one wholly absent from his conscious mind, but nonetheless implicit in the manner in which he arranged his material. Frazer amasses a vast amount of material from all over the world and finds a great deal of similarity of pattern or structure in it all. Officially, in terms of his own theory, this must be due to the fact that, all over the world, the human mind works much the same, so that much the same associations turn up all over the place. This generic similarity then enables us to fill gaps where evidence is lacking, as in the prehistory of Nemi. Human associations of ideas must have worked much the same in very early Nemi as anywhere else. So, we can reconstruct, Frazer thinks, that stage from what we know about the later Nemi practices. But all this is highly implausible. Association is terribly volatile. If we really constructed our mental worlds by association, there would be far, far more diversity and chaos than in fact there is. This is the crucial and conclusive criticism which Emile Durkheim directs at the entire empiricist tradition as an account of how we actually build up our worlds. Associations are born free, but are everywhere in chains, and these chains need to be explained. The astonishing conceptual homogeneity and discipline which we actually find in human cultures must have roots quite other than mere association. Frazer neither saw nor faced this problem, but the astonishing homogeneity of pattern which he had dredged up in his rich material encouraged others to seek, and indeed to find, an explanation of that order. What they found was not to his liking, and not at all in his style. This might be called the Jungian reading of Frazer. If patterns of belief are so strikingly similar in so many societies, could it not be that all these ideas are dredged out of some common shared collective unconscious? When T.S. Eliot uses Frazer in The Wasteland, it is in this spirit that he does so. Frazer was informed that Eliot made such use of him, but could make no sense of the poem, not surprisingly. His classical lucidity could not penetrate the newly fashionable deep obscurity. Such, then, was Frazerian anthropology, a global picture of the intellectual evolution of the entire human race. The picture was illustrated and supposedly established by an enormous mass of material assembled from all places and times, but torn out of context. None of the material had been gathered by the author himself, and he was not expected to do so. His response to the question as to whether he had ever met a savage is often quoted. Heaven forbid. The background story which provides the Golden Bough with its official plot, the rule which allows anyone who kills the current incumbent of the priestly office to succeed him, is not devoid of a certain ironic relevance for the history of anthropology. The succession of the kingship or priesthood in the sacred grove of anthropology passed from Frazer to Malinowski precisely in the manner in which things had once been acted out in Nemi. Intellectually speaking, Malinowski slew Frazer, and thereby succeeded him.